The year is 1945. The world was catching its breath after the thunder of the most brutal war in human history had finally fallen silent. For millions, the enemy had a clear and defined face, that of the Nazi soldier. And deep in the heart of Texas, thousands of these vanquished foes were held in prisoner of war camps, living symbols of a defeated ideology. But what if the lines drawn by war, etched in blood and propaganda, weren't as indelible as they seemed? What if, amid the dust and barbed wire, a story unfolded that defied everything we thought we knew about love and loyalty? Her name was Elbe Franke, and she was a ghost in the wrong country. She wasn't some battle-hardened soldier plucked from the front lines. Far from it. Elbe had been a young auxiliary in the Luftwaffe, a cog in the colossal German war machine, captured during the chaotic final days of the conflict in France. Now, she was just another number in a sea of grey uniforms, shipped across an ocean to a POW camp in the sweltering heat of Texas. It was a world away from anything she had ever known. Each day was a carbon copy of the last, a monotonous rhythm of roll calls, meager meals, and manual labor under a sun that felt alien and punishing. For Elbe, the physical hardship was nothing compared to the gnawing weight of her new reality. She was the enemy, a representative of a nation that had brought the world to its knees. The shame of defeat was a constant companion, mingling with a profound fear of what the future, if there was one, might hold for her and her family back home. The camp was a strange spectacle for the local Texans, a piece of a distant war dropped into their backyard. The prisoners were often put to work on local farms, their presence a constant unsettling reminder of the conflict. For Elbe, the stares of the American civilians were a mix of curiosity, fear, and pure, unadulterated hatred. She learned to keep her eyes down, to make herself small and invisible, a survival tactic in a land that saw her as a monster. She wasn't a Nazi zealot. She was just a girl who had been swept up in the tide of history like so many others. She missed the simple things, the smell of rain on Berlin's cobblestone streets, the taste of her mother's cooking, the sound of her own language spoken without whispers or suspicion. Here, she was defined by her uniform and her accent, a symbol of everything these people had fought against. Her individuality was stripped away, leaving only the label, enemy. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere was thick with despair. The women spoke in hushed tones of their homes, now likely turned to rubble, and of husbands and brothers whose fates were unknown. News from Germany was scarce and heavily censored, leaving them in an agonizing limbo. They were suspended between a past that was destroyed and a future that was terrifyingly blank. For Elbe, this communal grief was both a comfort and a crushing burden. She tried to hold onto a sliver of hope, a stubborn refusal to let the barbed wire fence cage her spirit entirely. She'd watch the vast, unending Texas sky and wonder if her family was looking at the same moon. It was a fragile connection to a world that felt a million miles away. This quiet resilience, this refusal to completely break, was a small act of defiance in a place designed to grind you down to nothing. The American guards were a constant looming presence. Most were indifferent, just men doing a job, counting down the days until they could go home themselves. They followed their orders, maintained their distance, and upheld the rigid barrier between victor and vanquished. The rules were crystal clear: no fraternization. The prisoners were not to be engaged with beyond what was absolutely necessary. They were the enemy, after all. But in any system built on absolutes, humanity has a funny way of finding the cracks. It doesn't announce itself with a trumpet blast, but in the quietest of moments. A flicker of understanding in someone's eyes, an unspoken gesture of kindness. Elbe had no idea that her life was about to be irrevocably changed, not by an order or a declaration, but by a simple, repeated glance from high up in a guard tower. But before we continue with this incredible story, please Take a moment to support our channel. If you believe that history is made of powerful human stories that deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. You'll be the first to know when we uncover more hidden stories like this one. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what city and country you're watching from. Sergeant Jack Stanley was not a man forged in the crucible of combat. He was a farm boy from Ohio with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor who'd been assigned to guard duty far from the European theater. His job was simple: watch. From his elevated perch in the wooden watchtower, he had a panoramic view of the camp, a monotonous landscape of barracks and fences. His duty was to see the prisoners as a collective threat, a nameless, faceless enemy. Day after day, he'd scan the compound, his eyes glazing over the identical grey uniforms. It was a boring, soul-crushing assignment. But then, he started noticing one of them. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was just that while the others moved with a defeated shuffle, heads bowed, she would sometimes stop just for a second and look up at the sky. There was a defiance in that small gesture that cut through the monotony. He didn't know her name. To him, she was just one of the German prisoners, yet his eyes began to seek her out during his shifts. He watched her during work details, noticing the determined set of her jaw as she labored under the punishing sun. He saw not an enemy soldier, but a young woman seemingly out of place and bearing a weight that seemed too heavy for her shoulders. He saw a person, and that changed everything. One afternoon, their eyes met. It was a fleeting moment, lasting no more than a second or two. There was no hostility in her gaze, only a weary curiosity. Jack felt an unexpected jolt. In that single, silent exchange, the carefully constructed walls of us versus them began to crumble. He was a guard. She was a prisoner. He was American. She was German. But in that glance, they were just two people trapped in the same strange, sun-baked corner of the world. He found himself thinking about her long after his shift ended. Who was she? What was her story? The propaganda posters back home depicted the Germans as snarling, monstrous figures. But the woman he saw from his tower didn't fit that mold. He started to question the black and white narrative he'd been fed his entire life. War, he was beginning to realize, was painted in shades of grey. Jack began to make small, almost imperceptible changes to his routine. He'd make sure he was in the tower, overlooking the section where she was assigned to work. It was a one-sided, silent conversation. He'd watch her, and occasionally she'd glance up, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. It was a dangerous game, a violation of the most fundamental rule of his post, but he couldn't stop. He saw the way the other prisoners sometimes treated her, the isolation in her posture. It stirred something protective in him. He started seeing her not as Elbe Franke, the enemy, but as Elbe, the person. This shift in perspective was subtle, but seismic. It set him on a path from which there would be no turning back, a path that would put him at odds with his country, his duty, and his own comrades. He wasn't a fool. He knew the risks. Being seen as sympathetic to a Kraut was professional suicide at best. At worst, it was treason. His fellow guards traded crude jokes about the female prisoners, viewing them as trophies of war. Jack's quiet observation stood in stark contrast to their boorish behavior, a silent rebellion against the dehumanizing machinery of war. The gaze from the watchtower was the beginning of it all. It was a connection forged across a divide that was supposed to be unbridgeable. It was a testament to the simple, powerful truth that no matter the uniform, no matter the flag, human eyes will always seek out other human eyes. And in that search, sometimes they find a reflection of themselves. This silent acknowledgement grew into a powerful, unspoken bond. It was a fragile seed of humanity planted in the barren soil of war, waiting for a single word, a single act of kindness, to make it grow. And that act wasn't far off. Jack knew he had to do something, anything, to bridge the physical distance between his tower and the ground below. The distance between the guard tower and the prisoner's yard was more than just physical. It was a chasm of rules, resentment, and the lingering bitterness of war. Direct communication was unthinkable, a line that, once crossed, could lead to dire consequences for both of them. Jack knew he had to be clever, but more than that, he had to be brave. His first move was small, almost trivial, yet it was a profound act of rebellion. It started with bread. Rations were plain and repetitive, and a little extra of anything was a luxury. During a work detail near the perimeter fence, where Jack was posted on ground patrol, he accidentally dropped a small parcel wrapped in cloth. He made a show of looking the other way, and from the corner of his eye, he saw Elby quickly retrieve it. Inside was a piece of bread from his own rations, softer and fresher than their camp-issued fare. This became their clandestine ritual. A piece of chocolate, an apple, a day-old newspaper in English so she could practice the language. These weren't just gifts, they were messages. Each item was a quiet declaration. I see you. You are not just a number to me. For Elbe, isolated and ostracized, these small acts of kindness were a lifeline, a whisper of humanity in a world that had become deafeningly silent and cruel. Soon, the silence needed to be broken. The risk was enormous, but the pull was even greater. Under the cover of darkness, during the late-night shifts when the camp was still and most other guards were drowsy, Jack would find a reason to patrol the fence near Elba's barracks. The first words were whispered, hesitant and fraught with the fear of being discovered. He'd ask simple questions. "Are you okay?" She'd reply in broken English, her voice barely audible. "Yes, thank you for the bread." It was stilted and clumsy, but it was a conversation. They were no longer just a guard and a prisoner. They were Jack and Elby. They were tearing down the wall between them, one whispered word at a time. Their secret meetings became the focal point of their existence. He told her about his family's farm in Ohio, the smell of the earth after rain, and his dreams of a simple life once the madness of the war was over. She, in turn, spoke of Berlin before the bombs, of studying music, of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. They were discovering the people behind the uniforms. In those hushed, stolen moments, they created a world of their own, a tiny bubble of peace, shielded by a chain-link fence and the vast, dark Texas night. They weren't an American and a German. They were just a man and a woman, finding solace in a connection that the rest of the world would have condemned without a second thought. It was an intoxicating, terrifying freedom. The danger was a constant thrilling hum beneath every word they exchanged. A stray footstep, a suspicious colleague, an insomniac prisoner, any of these could bring their fragile world crashing down. But the risk only seemed to intensify their bond. They were co-conspirators in a crime of compassion, and it drew them closer with an irresistible force. Jack would bring her books, old paperbacks with worn-out covers. For Elba, reading in English became more than just a way to pass the time. It was a bridge to his world. They'd discuss the stories in their whispered conversations, finding common ground in the universal human experiences captured on the pages. They were building a shared history, moment by stolen moment. The bread had been the first offering, a simple gesture of sustenance, but the words, the stories, the shared secrets, that was the real nourishment. They were feeding a part of themselves that the war had tried to starve, their capacity for human connection. The foundation had been laid, and what was growing between them was already too strong to be contained by a mere fence. The whispers through the fence were no longer enough. The air between Jack and Elbe crackled with an unspoken tension, a longing that grew more potent with each clandestine meeting. They had shared their pasts and their dreams, but a physical barrier always remained, a constant frustrating reminder of their impossible situation. The need to bridge that final gap became an ache, a desperate, all-consuming need. The opportunity, when it came, was born of chaos and routine. A group of prisoners, including Elbe, was being transferred from one work detail to another on the far side of the camp. It was a noisy, disorganized affair, with guards shouting orders and prisoners shuffling along in a weary column. For a few critical moments, the usual rigid surveillance was stretched thin. Jack, who had positioned himself along the route, saw his chance. He'd planned it meticulously. There was an old supply shed set back from the main path, partially obscured by overgrown brush. As the group passed, he caught Elb's eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod in its direction. It was a massive gamble. It required her to trust him completely, to break from the formation and risk immediate discovery and severe punishment. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't hesitate. As a guard at the head of the column turned to bark an order, Elbe stumbled, feigning a twisted ankle. In the brief moment of confusion, she slipped away from the group and melted into the shadows behind the shed. Seconds later, Jack was there, his face taut with adrenaline. The world seemed to fall away, the sounds of the camp fading to a distant hum. They stood there for a heartbeat, breathless, the silence between them charged with everything left unsaid. Then he moved. Jack closed the small distance between them, his hand coming up to gently cup her face. It was the first time they had ever touched. The rough texture of his skin against hers was an electric shock, a jolt of reality more powerful than any whispered word. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was desperate and hungry, a release of months of pent-up longing, fear, and hope. For Elbe, it was a tidal wave of sensation, a confirmation that she was still a woman, still capable of feeling something other than shame and despair. In that moment, she wasn't a prisoner, and he wasn't her guard. They were just two souls clinging to each other. The kiss was an act of profound defiance. It was treason against the ideologies that had pitted their countries against each other. It was a betrayal of their respective comrades. In the eyes of the world, what they were doing was an abomination, a fraternization with the enemy that was punishable by court-martial for him and severe retribution for her. But in the secrecy of that moment, it felt like the only sane thing in a world gone mad. They broke apart, gasping for air, their foreheads resting against each other. The reality of their situation came rushing back in. They had crossed a line, a point of no return. What had been a secret, emotional connection was now something physical, something real and undeniable. The stakes had been raised to a terrifying new level. There was no going back now. Jack pressed a small, folded piece of paper into her hand, a note, something she could read later. "Be careful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He gave her one last, lingering look before slipping away, melting back into his role as a sergeant in the U.S. Army. Elbe took a deep breath, composed herself, and rejoined the group, her limp now entirely convincing. Later that night, in the dim light of the barracks, she unfolded the note. It contained just 3 words: "I love you." The stolen kiss behind the shed wasn't just a moment of passion, it was a seal on a pact. It was the moment their forbidden friendship blossomed into a dangerous, all-consuming love affair. And it was the beginning of a whole new set of troubles. In the claustrophobic confines of a prison camp, secrets are a currency that is impossible to hoard for long. Elbe's special treatment did not go unnoticed by the other German women. The subtle signs, a slightly healthier glow, a flicker of something other than despair in her eyes, the way her gaze would drift towards a particular watchtower, were all meticulously catalogued by the sharp, resentful eyes of her fellow prisoners. The whispers started first, slithering through the barracks like a poisonous snake. They called her Ami Liebchen, a cruel, derogatory term that translated to Ami Lover. It was an accusation spat with venom, branding her a traitor not just to their captors, but to her own kind. She was seen as consorting with the enemy, selling her dignity for scraps of kindness from an American guard. The other women, hardened by war and embittered by defeat, saw her actions as a deep betrayal. They were all suffering together, bound by a shared national shame. In their eyes, Elbe was breaking that fragile solidarity. They believed she was profiting from their collective misery, finding comfort in the arms of the very people who had bombed their cities and killed their men. It was an unforgivable sin. The isolation was swift and brutal. Women who had once shared stories of home now turned their backs on her. At mealtimes, a space would clear around her as if she were carrying a plague. Her bunk became an island in a sea of hostility. The few possessions she had were accidentally damaged. The psychological warfare was relentless, designed to break her spirit and force her back in line. It wasn't just shunning. The hostility escalated. Vicious rumors were spread, accusing her of trading information for favors. Threats were hissed in her ear as she passed by. One evening, she returned to her bunk to find a cherished family photo torn to shreds, a clear and menacing message. She was an outcast, a pariah among her own people. For Elbe, this was a unique and terrible form of torture. She was being punished not by her enemies but by her friends, by the very women who should have been her support system. It forced her into an impossible position, caught between her burgeoning love for Jack and her loyalty to a homeland that was now represented by these angry, grieving women. The fury of her comrades was rooted in a deep sense of wounded pride. Germany had lost the war, and their national identity was in tatters. Clinging to a rigid code of honor, even in a POW camp, was all they had left. Elbe, by fraternizing with an American, was tainting that last shred of dignity. She was a walking, breathing symbol of their ultimate humiliation. The irony was devastating. The only source of hope and human connection in her desolate life was the very thing that caused her to be so utterly alone. Jack's love was her sanctuary and her prison. It shielded her from the despair of her situation, but also painted a target on her back, making her a lightning rod for all the anger and frustration festering within the camp. She tried to explain, to make them understand that Jack wasn't just an ami, that he was a good man, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. To them, he was nothing but a uniform, a symbol of their defeat. They couldn't see the individual, only the enemy. They were blinded by the same black and white worldview that Jack himself had started to question. Pushed to the brink, Elbe retreated further into herself and her secret relationship with Jack. The hostility of the other prisoners, intended to drive them apart, had the opposite effect. It solidified their bond, making them allies against a world that refused to understand. They were no longer just two people in love. They were partners in a desperate rebellion. The chain of command in the U.S. Army is built on discipline and observation, and Jack Stanley's behavior was beginning to deviate from the norm. His commanding officer, Captain Miller, was a career soldier, a man who saw the world in regulations and clear-cut objectives. He started noticing small but significant anomalies in Sergeant Stanley's conduct. Jack was volunteering for extra patrols, specifically near certain sections of the fence, and his reports had become less detailed, more perfunctory. Miller's suspicions were further piqued by whispers from other guards. They joked about how Stanley seemed sweet on one of the German prisoners. While much of it was barracks room banter, there was an undercurrent of genuine concern. Fraternization wasn't just against the rules, it was a security risk. A compromised guard was a weak link in the camp's security, and Miller wouldn't tolerate it. He called Jack into his office one afternoon. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Miller didn't beat around the bush. He spoke of duty, of loyalty to one's country, and of the unbridgeable gap between a U.S. soldier and a prisoner of war. He reminded Jack that these prisoners were the enemy, responsible for the deaths of thousands of American boys. It was a stern, paternalistic warning. "Don't let your compassion cloud your judgment, Sergeant," Miller had said, his eyes like steel. "Your job is to guard them, not to befriend them. Any deviation will be met with the full force of the Uniform Code of Military Justice." The threat of a court-martial hung heavy in the air. For Jack, it was a chilling wake-up call. His secret love affair could cost him his career, his freedom, and his honor. The pressure was immense. Jack was now walking a tightrope. He had to maintain the appearance of a diligent, by-the-book guard while continuing his clandestine relationship with Elbe. Every conversation, every past note was now fraught with a new level of paranoia. He felt the eyes of his fellow soldiers on him, scrutinizing his every move, waiting for him to slip up. The controversy of his actions wasn't just a matter of breaking rules. It struck at the heart of the post-war American psyche. The nation was healing from deep wounds, and anti-German sentiment was still rampant. A soldier falling for a German prisoner could be seen as a profound betrayal of his fallen comrades. He wasn't just a man in love, he was a potential traitor. This suspicion forced Jack and Elbe to become even more cautious. Their meetings became less frequent and more frantic. The joy of their connection was now tinged with the constant metallic taste of fear. The very institution Jack had sworn to serve was now his adversary, an ever-watchful eye that threatened to expose and destroy the most important thing in his life. Some of the other guards, who had once been his friends, grew distant. They couldn't understand his softness. They had fought, or knew men who had died fighting, people just like the ones Jack was guarding. To them, his compassion was a sign of weakness, a dangerous flaw in a soldier. He was becoming as much of an outcast as Elbe was. He was caught in an impossible bind. His heart told him that loving Elbe was the most natural thing in the world, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended politics and war. But his training, his uniform, and the suspicious glares of his superiors screamed that it was a profound error, a betrayal of everything he was supposed to stand for. The American suspicion was the other side of the coin to the German fury. Both Jack and Elbe were being squeezed by their own people, condemned for daring to see a person instead of an enemy. The two lovers were now truly alone, adrift on a small island of their own making, with hostile tides rising on all sides. In the spring of 1946, a wave of change swept through the POW camps across America. The war in Europe was officially over, the ink on the treaties was dry, and the colossal logistical task of tidying up the remnants of the conflict was underway. For the thousands of German prisoners held on US soil, this meant one thing: they were finally going home. The news spread through the Texas camp like wildfire. For most of the prisoners, it was a moment of profound, complicated relief. They would be free. They could return to whatever was left of their homes and families. The years of captivity were coming to an end. A cautious, fragile sense of hope permeated the barracks, a feeling that had been absent for far too long. But for Jack and Elbe, the official announcement felt like a judge's gavel slamming down, delivering a death sentence: repatriation. The word echoed in their minds, a synonym for separation, for the end of their world. The very thing everyone else celebrated as liberation was, for them, a condemnation. The end of the war for everyone else marked the beginning of the end for them. The camp buzzed with the logistics of the mass departure. Rosters were checked, travel arrangements were made, and the entire compound was gripped by a sense of impending finality. For the two lovers, every sunrise was a countdown, each day a grain of sand slipping through the hourglass. The precious stolen moments they had were now numbered, and the number was shrinking with terrifying speed. Desperation took hold. They met in a frantic, hurried whisper, the weight of their impending separation crushing them. What could they do? The machinery of international politics and military bureaucracy was immense and impersonal. They were two insignificant people caught in its gears. There was no appeal, no recourse, no way to stop the inevitable. Jack felt a profound sense of powerlessness. He was a sergeant in the victorious army, yet he was utterly helpless to keep the woman he loved from being shipped away. He explored every possibility, no matter how remote. Could she apply for asylum? Could he sponsor her somehow? Every avenue he investigated led to a dead end, blocked by regulations and a mountain of red tape. She was an enemy alien, and she was being sent back. Period. Elbe's feelings were even more tangled. A part of her yearned to see her family, to know if they had survived the bombing of Berlin. But the thought of leaving Jack was a physical pain, a tearing sensation in her chest. Germany was her home, but Jack was her future. Now she was being forced to watch that future sail away over the horizon. The irony was cruel and absolute. The end of a global conflict, a moment of peace and celebration for the entire world, was the very thing that would tear them apart. Their love had bloomed in the unnatural ecosystem of the prison camp, a rare flower in a barren wasteland. Now the return of normalcy was about to uproot it and leave it to wither. They watched as the other prisoners began to pack their meager belongings, their faces a mixture of anxiety and excitement. For Elbe, their joy was like a slap in the face. She had to pretend, to put on a brave face and mimic their relief, while inside her heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. She was going home, but the only home she cared about was being left behind. The final date was posted. In 1 week, the transport ships would arrive. 1 week, 7 days, 168 hours. That was all the time they had left. The sentence had been handed down, and there would be no stay of execution. All that remained was to figure out how to say goodbye. The night before Elbe's departure was thick and starless, mirroring the bleakness in their hearts. The camp was unusually quiet, a settled calm before the storm of tomorrow's mass movement. Every tick of the clock was a countdown to their separation. Jack, pulling every string he could, had arranged one final, desperate meeting. It was a risk of monumental proportions, but it was one they had to take. He found her waiting near the same secluded supply shed where they had shared their first kiss. It seemed like a lifetime ago. In the faint moonlight, he could see the tracks of tears on her face. There were no easy words, no platitudes that could soften the blow of what was coming. They just stood there for a long moment, clinging to each other, a silent, desperate embrace against the inevitable. "This can't be it," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I can't just let you go." But they both knew he had no choice. The world had made a decision for them. They were pawns in a game whose rules they couldn't change. The future they had dreamed of in hushed tones through a chain-link fence was dissolving into an impossible fantasy. But Jack was not a man to surrender to despair. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out 2 things. The first was a worn photograph of himself, a formal army portrait where he looked impossibly young and serious. The second was a carefully folded piece of paper. He pressed them into Elbe's hand, his grip tight and urgent. "This is my home address," he said, his voice firm, trying to inject a strength he didn't feel. "In Ohio, my family's farm. No matter what happens, no matter where they send you, this is where I'll be." It was more than just a piece of paper. It was an anchor, a fixed point in a swirling sea of uncertainty. Elbe looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. What could she possibly do with an address an ocean away? But then he spoke the words that would define the rest of her life. "Find me," he said, his gaze intense, willing her to believe. "It might take years. Things are a mess over there, but don't give up. Find me, Elbe. I'll be waiting for you." It was an insane, audacious promise, a promise made against the backdrop of a shattered continent, broken communication systems, and the towering walls of international bureaucracy. It was a long shot, a 1 in a million chance. But in that moment of absolute desperation, it was the only thing they had to hold on to. It was a flicker of light in an all-consuming darkness. He made her memorize the address, repeating the street name and the town over and over, branding it into her memory in case the paper was lost or confiscated. It was a lifeline, a mantra she could repeat to herself in the difficult days ahead. It transformed their goodbye from a final ending into a temporary pause, to be continued. Their final kiss was not like the first. It wasn't frantic or desperate. It was slow, tender, and deeply sad, a lingering farewell filled with the weight of their promise. It was a seal on their pact, a commitment to defy distance, time, and the chaos of the post-war world. They were planting a seed of hope for a future they had no right to expect. As he slipped back into the shadows, leaving her alone for the last time, Elbe clutched the photo and the address to her chest. They were her only tangible links to him, her talismans against the terrifying uncertainty that lay ahead. The promise was everything. It was a compass that would guide her through the ruins of her homeland, and she prayed, one day, lead her back to him. The journey across the Atlantic was a grim, monotonous voyage. Elbe and the other women were herded onto a transport ship, a floating prison carrying them back to a continent in ruins. When she finally stepped onto German soil, the reality of what had become of her home was a physical blow. This wasn't the Germany she had left. It was a ghost, a corpse of a nation. She made her way to Berlin, a city she barely recognized. Entire city blocks were gone, reduced to mountains of rubble and the skeletal remains of buildings. The air was thick with the dust of destruction and the stench of decay. The vibrant capital she remembered from her youth had been systematically erased, replaced by a landscape of utter desolation. It was an inferno of ruin. Survival became the only priority, a brutal day-to-day struggle. Food was scarce, ration cards were more valuable than money, and a gnawing hunger was the constant companion of every citizen. People lived in the basements of bombed-out houses, huddling together for warmth against the bitter cold. The Stunde Null, or 0 hour, was not just a concept, it was a grim, lived reality. In this new, harsh world, Elbe was a pariah twice over. She was a German in a defeated and occupied nation, looked upon with suspicion by the Allied forces who now patrolled the streets. But worse, her time in America and the rumors that had followed her from the camp made her an outcast among her own people. Talk of her American lover made her a target for resentment in a populace desperate for a scapegoat. She eventually found what was left of her family's apartment. It was barely standing. Her mother was alive, aged decades by the hardship, but her father and brother were gone, casualties of the war's final, bloody days. The reunion was hollowed out by grief, another piece of her old life that had been irrevocably lost. There was little comfort to be found, only a shared, silent pain. Amidst this daily battle for existence, the memory of Jack and his promise was her secret strength. In the freezing nights, huddled under a thin blanket, she would take out his photograph, its corners now soft and worn. She would whisper the address in Ohio to herself, a prayer in the darkness. The memory of his warmth was a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving reality of post-war Berlin. Finding a way to live was hard enough. Finding a way to leave seemed impossible. Germany was carved up into occupation zones, and travel was severely restricted. The idea of getting back to America was a fantasy, a dream so distant it felt like a cruel joke. Her daily life was a relentless grind of queuing for bread, hauling water, and trying to avoid the dangers of a city teeming with desperate people. She took on any work she could find, clearing rubble, mending clothes, anything to earn a few marks for food. Her hands, which had once studied piano, became rough and calloused. She grew thin and weary. But the promise she had made to Jack was a fire in her belly, a stubborn ember of defiance that refused to be extinguished by the misery surrounding her. The Germany she had returned to was a purgatory. It was a place of ghosts, of memories of what used to be, and of a people grappling with an immense collective guilt. For Elbe, it was a test of endurance. She had to survive the inferno, not just for herself, but for the chance, however slim, that she might one day fulfill her promise and find her way back to the man who was waiting an ocean away. Every day she survived was a small victory, a step, she hoped, on the long, arduous road back to Ohio. She was no longer just a prisoner of the Americans. She was now a prisoner of the peace, trapped in the wreckage of her own country, armed with nothing but a fading photograph and an impossible promise. As soon as a semblance of a postal service was re-established in Berlin, Elbe began to write. Each letter was a monumental effort, composed by candlelight on scraps of paper she had scrounged. The words poured out of her, descriptions of the ruins, her struggle to survive, and most importantly, her unwavering love and her determination to fulfill her promise. Each letter was a message in a bottle, tossed into a turbulent sea of post-war chaos. She sent them to the only address she knew, the farm in Ohio. She wrote about her hopes, her fears, and her memories of their time in Texas. She asked if he was okay, if he was still waiting, if he still remembered her. The letters were a one-sided conversation, a desperate attempt to keep their connection alive across the vast, silent expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Weeks turned into months. She would watch the postman on his route, her heart leaping with a desperate, foolish hope every time he approached, only to have it sink again when he passed her by. No reply ever came. The silence from America was deafening, a crushing void that began to eat away at her resolve. She sent another letter, and then another, each one more pleading than the last. The silence gave birth to 1,000 terrible possibilities. Had he been killed in an accident? Had he moved away without a forwarding address? Or, the most painful thought of all, had he simply forgotten her? Had their impossible love affair been nothing more than a fleeting, wartime romance for him? A memory to be packed away with his uniform? The uncertainty was a slow, creeping poison. A year passed, then another. Germany was slowly, painstakingly beginning to rebuild. The rubble was being cleared, and the first signs of a new life, the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, were beginning to sprout. Life was still hard, but the daily grinding struggle for pure survival was starting to ease. For Elbe, however, the silence from Jack cast a long shadow over any progress. Her friends and family, what was left of them, urged her to move on. "He was an American soldier, Elbe," they'd say, their voices a mixture of pity and impatience. "Forget him, build a life here." To them, her fixation on a man an ocean away, a man who never wrote back, was a foolish obsession, a refusal to accept the reality of her situation. But how could she forget? The promise was woven into the very fabric of her being. It had been her reason for surviving the worst of times. To let go of it felt like letting go of herself, so she continued to hope, even as that hope became a source of quiet, constant pain. The silence was a wall she kept throwing herself against, bruising her spirit with each unanswered letter. She tried to imagine his life. Was he back on the farm, working the land, the memory of the Texas POW camp fading like an old photograph? The image was both comforting and agonizing. She wanted him to be happy, but the thought of him being happy without her was a dagger to the heart. The silence allowed her imagination to conjure both beautiful dreams and heartbreaking nightmares. The lack of a response was, in many ways, worse than an outright rejection. A letter saying "I've moved on" would have been brutal, but it would have been an ending. The silence offered no closure, just an endless, agonizing limbo. It suspended her between a past she couldn't return to and a future that might never arrive. After several years and dozens of unanswered letters, the hope began to curdle into a dull, persistent ache. The fire that had sustained her was dwindling to embers. The silence of the Atlantic was not just an absence of words, it was the sound of a dream slowly dying. She was on the verge of giving up, of finally accepting that the war had claimed one last victim, their future. By the early 1950s, the world had changed dramatically. The Marshall Plan was fueling Germany's reconstruction, and the deep scars of the war were slowly being covered by new buildings and a renewed sense of purpose. Elbe had managed to secure a steady job as a secretary, and for the first time in years, she had a small measure of stability. Life was becoming normal again, or at least a new version of it. But for Elbe, this newfound normalcy felt like a beautifully decorated cage. She went through the motions of life, but her heart remained in a holding pattern, forever circling over an address in Ohio. The unanswered letters had ceased, but the question mark they left behind loomed larger than ever. She was approaching a crossroads: accept her fate in Germany or take one last, monumental gamble. The idea began as a whisper in the back of her mind, a wild, improbable fantasy. What if she didn't wait for a letter? What if she just went? The thought was terrifying. It meant leaving the security she had painstakingly rebuilt. It meant abandoning her aging mother and the few friends she had. It meant venturing alone into the country that had once been her jailer. She began to save money, a secret, obsessive mission. Every spare pfennig was tucked away in a small tin box hidden under a loose floorboard. She worked extra hours, took on mending work in the evenings, and denied herself any small luxury. Her colleagues wondered at her frugality, but they had no idea she wasn't saving for a new coat. She was saving for a new life. Selling her few remaining valuables was the next step. A locket from her grandmother, her father's old watch. Each sale was a painful severing of ties to her past, but a necessary sacrifice for her potential future. Her tin box slowly filled with a modest collection of currency, the tangible result of her quiet determination. It was a freedom fund. The decision solidified from a fantasy into a concrete plan. She would go to America, she would find that farm in Ohio, and she would get an answer, one way or another. She needed closure. She needed to know if the silence was because of lost mail, a changed address, or a changed heart. The not knowing was a wound that would never heal on its own. When she finally told her mother, the reaction was a storm of tears and protestations. "You're chasing a ghost, Elbe. He has forgotten you. America will not welcome you." Her mother's fears were logical, born of love and a desire to protect her daughter from more pain. But Elbe's resolve was unshakable. This was something she had to do for herself. Securing a visa was a bureaucratic nightmare, a mountain of paperwork and suspicious officials. A single German woman wanting to travel to the US with no official sponsor was highly unusual. But she was persistent, her quiet desperation eventually wearing down the layers of red tape. When the visa was finally stamped in her passport, it felt like a miracle. Finally, the day came. With a small, worn suitcase containing all her worldly possessions, Jack's photograph, and the address she knew by heart, she stood on the docks at Hamburg. She was about to board a passenger ship bound for New York. It was the decision that would define her life, an act of faith so profound it bordered on madness. As the ship pulled away from the shore, watching the coastline of her homeland recede, she felt a terrifying mix of exhilaration and dread. She was a woman sailing toward a promise, with no guarantee of what she would find. She was either on a fool's errand or the final leg of the most incredible journey of her life. Stepping off the boat in New York City was a dizzying, overwhelming experience. The sheer scale of the city, the noise, the river of strange faces, and the babble of English. It was a world away from the quiet resilience of post-war Berlin. Elbe felt incredibly small and utterly alone, a solitary figure armed with a single aging address and a heart full of trepidation. She was a stranger in a strange land, all over again. After navigating the bewildering maze of immigration and customs, her first task was to get to Ohio. The bus ride was a long, rattling journey through a country that seemed impossibly vast and prosperous. She stared out the window at the rolling hills and tidy towns, a landscape so different from the rubble she had left behind. This was Jack's world, and she was an alien in it. When she finally arrived in the small Ohio town listed on the paper, a wave of nervous excitement washed over her. She was here. She had made it. Using her halting English, she got directions to the Stanley farm. The final walk down a long, dusty country road felt surreal, each step closing a gap of years and thousands of miles. Her heart pounded in a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But when she reached the farmhouse, the first crack in her hope appeared. It looked different. There was a new coat of paint, a different car in the drive. A woman she didn't recognize answered the door, a friendly but puzzled look on her face. "Stanley?" the woman said. "Oh, they sold this place a few years back, moved away after the old man passed." The words hit Elbe like a physical blow. They were gone. The one fixed point in her universe had vanished. The woman had no idea where the family had moved, suggesting she check the county records office. It was the beginning of a frustrating and soul-crushing search. Elbe was now a detective in a foreign land, chasing a ghost with a fading trail. She spent the next few weeks moving from one small town to the next, following vague leads and half-remembered rumors. She subsisted on the last of her savings, staying in cheap boarding houses and eating sparingly. The language barrier was a constant struggle, and the suspicion she received as a German woman was a palpable, chilling presence. People were polite, but distant. Her only companion was the worn photograph of Jack. In moments of despair, she would pull it out and stare at his young, serious face, trying to draw strength from it. Was he even still in Ohio? Had he moved across the country? The sheer size of America, once a marvel, now felt like a curse. A vast haystack in which she was trying to find a single precious needle. Her money began to dwindle at an alarming rate. The desperate search was taking its toll, physically and emotionally. The hope that had propelled her across an ocean was being eroded by a constant stream of dead ends and false leads. The thought of failure, of having to return to Germany defeated, was a terrifying prospect she refused to entertain. One day, in a dusty library basement, poring over old phone directories, she found a promising lead. A J. Stanley was listed in a suburb of Cleveland, an industrial city hours away. It was a common name, a long shot, but it was the only thread she had left. With her last few dollars, she bought a bus ticket, her entire quest now riding on this one final chance. The bus ride to Cleveland was a quiet, prayerful journey. She had come too far to give up now. The search had stripped away everything but her core determination. She was no longer just a woman in love. She was a pilgrim at the end of a long, arduous journey, about to discover if her holy grail was real or just a mirage. The address led her to a modest, post-war suburban neighborhood. It was a street lined with identical houses, green lawns, and a quiet, settled feeling of domesticity. It couldn't have been more different from the rustic farmhouse she had first imagined. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Elbe walked up the concrete path to the small, tidy house, her knuckles white as she clutched her purse. This was it. Her entire journey, the years of waiting, the ocean voyage, the desperate search, all culminated in this single moment. Her heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. She raised a trembling hand and knocked on the door. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet afternoon air. For a few agonizing seconds, there was only silence. Then the lock turned, the door swung open, and there he was. He was older, of course. The boyish face from the photograph was now a man's, lined with a few more years of life. His hair was a little thinner, but his eyes were the same. It was Jack. A tidal wave of relief, joy, and a dozen other emotions crashed over her, leaving her speechless. For a moment the world stood still. Jack stared at her, his face a mask of utter disbelief. He recognized her instantly. The name Elbe escaped his lips, not as a question, but as a breath, a whisper of a ghost from a past he had long since buried. Time collapsed, and for a fleeting second they were back in Texas, two young people caught in an impossible love. But the perfect cinematic reunion she had played out in her mind 1,000 times shattered in the very next instant. A woman's voice called out from inside the house, "Honey, who is it?" And then a woman appeared behind Jack, wiping her hands on an apron, a curious and friendly smile on her face. Her smile faltered slightly as she took in the scene. Her husband, pale and shocked, and the strange, emotional woman on their doorstep. The final devastating blow came not as a sight, but as a sound. From deeper within the house, the unmistakable cry of a small child echoed through the sudden, tense silence. A wife, a child. The simple domestic sounds were a death knell to the dream Elbe had carried across the world. Jack had a life, a family. He hadn't been waiting. The strength that had carried her across an ocean deserted her. Her legs felt weak, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The woman, his wife, looked from Jack's stricken face to Elbe's, her expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, painful understanding. The air on the porch was thick with unspoken history, shattered hopes, and a colossal, heartbreaking awkwardness. Jack finally found his voice, stammering her name again, ushering her inside, with a gesture that was both welcoming and panicked. He introduced his wife, Sarah, his voice strained. The three of them stood in the living room, a tableau of a past colliding violently with the present. The comfortable lived-in room, with its family photos and children's toys, was a testament to the life he had built in her absence. Elbe felt a profound, chilling cold spread through her. She hadn't just found Jack. She had found his entire world, a world in which it was painfully clear there was no room for her. The silence from across the Atlantic suddenly had a new, crushing explanation. He hadn't forgotten her, perhaps, but he had most certainly moved on. The knock on the door had brought her the answer she had so desperately sought. But the answer was not the one she had prayed for. It was a truth so painful, so final, that it threatened to break her completely. The journey was over, and it had led her to the one place she never expected to be, the outside of a closed door. That afternoon was a surreal, heartbreaking blur. After the initial crushing shock, Jack's wife, Sarah, with a quiet strength and grace that was astonishing, took the children to a neighbor's house, leaving Jack and Elbe alone to talk. The living room, moments before a symbol of Elbe's shattered dream, became a quiet, neutral ground for the final, painful chapter of their story. Jack, his voice thick with a mixture of guilt and sorrow, finally explained the silence. "I never got your letters, Elbe," he said, his eyes pleading with her to believe him. "Not a single one." He explained that after he was discharged, he had waited, haunting the post office for months, then years. The chaotic state of the German mail system in the late 40s had swallowed her words, creating a void of silence. He told her how, after nearly 3 years of receiving nothing, he had slowly, painfully forced himself to accept the worst. He imagined she had been killed in the post-war chaos, or that she had found someone else, or that she had simply decided to forget the American soldier from her past. The not knowing had tormented him, but eventually life, as it always does, had insisted he move forward. He met Sarah a few years later. She was a kind, gentle woman who had helped heal a part of him he thought was broken forever. He had built a new life, a good life, but he confessed that a part of him had always wondered, had always been haunted by the ghost of the German prisoner he'd loved. He had locked that part of his story away, believing it had no ending. Listening to him, Elbe felt not anger, but a profound, sweeping sadness. There was no villain in this story. There was no betrayal, no forgotten promise. They were simply two people who had been defeated by circumstances beyond their control. They were victims of a broken postal system, of the chaos of Reconstruction, of time itself. The war, it turned out, had one last cruel trick to play. They talked for hours. They spoke of the camp, of the risks they took, of the dreams they had shared. They reminisced not as former lovers considering a reunion, but as two old soldiers, survivors of a private war, finally comparing their scars and finding a sense of peace in the shared history. It was a conversation filled with what-ifs, but devoid of accusation. There was a moment of pure, painful honesty when he looked at her and said, "If I had gotten even one letter, Elbe, my whole life would be different." And she knew he was telling the truth. In that single sentence lay the entire tragedy of their story. A love powerful enough to cross oceans, but not powerful enough to overcome a lost piece of mail. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, they both knew it was time for the final goodbye. This wasn't the frantic, hopeful farewell of the prison camp. It was a quiet, somber acknowledgement of reality. They hugged, a brief but deeply felt embrace, a final closing of the door on a chapter of their lives. He offered her money, a place to stay, anything she needed. She politely refused. She had come for an answer, and she had received it. It was a brutal truth, but it was a truth nonetheless, and in it, there was a strange kind of freedom. The limbo was over. She could finally stop waiting. Elbe walked away from that suburban house with a heavy heart. but also with a sense of closure. The great, defining mystery of her life had been solved. The time and the war, in the end, had won. Their love story would forever remain a poignant, unfinished symphony, a testament to what might have been. Elbe Franke did not return to Germany. In a final, remarkable act of resilience, she chose to build a new life for herself in America, the country that held both her greatest love and her deepest heartbreak. She settled a few states away, forever near, yet forever separate from the man she had crossed the world to find. Their story never had a Hollywood ending. They did not ride off into the sunset. Instead, their reunion gave them something more real and perhaps more valuable, a conclusion. It replaced years of painful, ambiguous silence with a shared, tragic understanding, allowing them both to finally and truly move on with their lives. The tale of Elbe and Jack is a powerful testament to the human spirit's ability to love across even the most fortified of divides. It forces us to look beyond the uniforms and flags and to question the very nature of loyalty. Is it owed to a nation or to the quiet, undeniable truth of the human heart? Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. We have to ask, do you think Elbe's quest was the ultimate tragedy, or was the closure she found a testament to a love so powerful it had to be seen through to the end? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you are fascinated by the hidden stories of history that challenge our perspectives, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. It helps us to continue bringing these forgotten narratives to light. Until the next story,